Look for any interest in the lower portion of the trunk, any changes of direction, really nice taper, starting wide and getting narrower, and any features, maybe a bit of interesting deadwood or some really aged bark. Anything that sets it apart and makes it look more like an old tree than the rest of the material that you've got in front of you. Today I'd like to talk to you about the very first step of creating your own DIY bonsai tree, and that is choosing the starting material that you're going to transform into a bonsai. Hi, I'm Darren, and on my channel I do a lot of videos exploring the creation and maintenance of bonsai trees from raw or accessible material to help the beginner get the most out of this hobby that can be daunting at times. Try to choose a reliable species. It's going to be a species that can thrive in your climate and has been used a lot for bonsai before, is well understood and is readily available, so that if the worst happens and something goes wrong, you can buy more, or if you fall in love with it, you can buy more. Let me know in the comments below what species would be suitable for DIY bonsai in your area. I'm sure there are other people local to you that would love to know. So this is a Berberis Thunbergii Etropurpurea nana, a dwarf red leaf Japanese barberry. It's a nice little tree, cost £10. So why did I choose this tree? Well, I think it's got some nice age to the bark forming. The trunk's a reasonable thickness for a smallish tree. It's got plenty of branches to work with, and some have got some pretty attractive movement in them. In my opinion, you can just see the bonsai forming already. It's kind of trained itself to a certain degree. A lot of nursery material you see has quite a sort of a two-dimensional appearance. That's quite common because they don't rotate them or anything like that, so the tree usually takes advantage of the sunlight it can get. But you can develop the depth to the design over time. Obviously, as you can see, some of the branches in here are a little bit congested and they're not perfect. That's to be expected. You're not looking for a perfect bonsai in a big deep pot, you're looking for potential. Dying to get my teeth into this one. The next factor that I like to keep on my mind when I'm looking at bonsai material in garden centres or nurseries is proportion. There are aesthetic guidelines that can help us make decisions, and one of them is the relationship to the trunk and the final height of the tree. The thicker the trunk is, the taller the tree can be, because the trunk will look in proportion with a bigger tree if it's thicker. Or if it's got a narrower trunk, you might consider keeping it as a smaller tree, because that'll look more in proportion with the thickness of the trunk. But it goes further than that, because if you've got a very slender trunk but it has some really nice curves to it, and maybe it tapers slowly, it can lend itself to a taller tree that has more of a flowing, elegant feel to it, a more graceful appearance. The flip side of that is if you've got a thicker trunk that has quite drastic taper and not a lot of curves and movement, that can look really good as a shorter but powerful tree. And you'll build some thick, short branches and a really dense canopy on that. What we don't want though is a really young plant with a very narrow trunk that's just basically a straight stick coming out of the ground and one or two branches on the end of it. It's going to take a long time to make a tree out of that. I'm not saying you can't make a bonsai out of it. I'm just saying that there might be better material if you go somewhere else or look at a different area. So this little potentier is a great example of a nice trunk. It's got some really nice movement, very sinewy movement, and it's got an absolute ton of branches to work with. It's not the typical thick trunk material that a lot of people look for. But I think there's a lot of enjoyment to be had from something that tapers slowly and is slender and more elegant. Not everything has to be a powerful representation of a tree. There's also beauty to be found in more elegant representations. Potentier flower really well, and they're really good growers. They're ideal for beginners. They do have a couple of quirks which I have spoken about and I will continue to talk about in other videos, so keep an eye out for those. When you're looking around for potentier, the main thing to look for is a single trunk. A lot of them have very shrubby habits, so there'll be like loads of stick thin straight branches coming from the soil. The reason I selected this particular piece of material, it has a single trunk with a bit of thickness to it. It's not, it's not huge, it's about the thickness of my finger, but it's got some really nice movement. Another factor that's really important in choosing bonsai material is what we call the nabari. And to understand nabari, if you go and look at an older established tree out in the wild, often they have these thick surface roots that look like it's holding on to the soil so that the tree is really stable and it's not, it's gripping the ground and not going anywhere. That is the nabari, or root spread, or trunk base, or whatever you want to call it. That's a really important feature of decent bonsai. But plants grown for the nursery are often planted really deep in their pot, so you're going to have to dig around in the soil and see if you can find even just a mere hint of thickening towards the base of the trunk. It's actually quite rare to find something with an absolutely perfect radial nabari in a garden centre or a nursery, but if you do find one, buy it. Sometimes you can find that there's something really unappealing underneath the surface that puts you off buying it. Maybe the trunk just goes really narrow and uninteresting, or maybe there's just like a whole bunch of roots coming off the side of a trunk and looking really awkward. Check it, you never know what you're going to find. Branches. Now when I'm shopping for bonsai material, I'm going to favour plants or trees that have branches to work with, partly because it saves time in growing new ones. It gives you more options to work with, so you can have much more fun working with the material if it's got plenty of branches already. And there are species out there that don't readily backbud on old wood, so if you've got a 6-foot trunk with not a single branch to be seen, and you're thinking, okay, it's got no branches, but it's got some thickness or maybe something else that's interesting about it, I wonder if I can grow new branches. A lot of conifers and some broadleaf species aren't going to be obliging in producing buds low down on the trunk at such a height that makes it suitable for growing as bonsai. If it is lacking branches, make sure you Google it to see if you'll be able to grow new ones. But besides all that, if you've got plenty of branches to work with, it's more fun. And that's what this is about. Fun. Favour healthy material. Unless it's an outstanding piece of material, it's probably not going to be worth saving a few bucks versus buying something that's healthy, simply because it's going to take you 1, 2, maybe even 3 years to nurse that thing back to health before you can safely do bonsai work on that plant. Now I don't know about you, but 1, 2 or 3 years for the sake of saving $10 or £10 here and there, it's not always worth it unless it's exceptional material and you just have to buy it. This is a Hinoki cypress, Nana gracilis. It's a dwarf variety. I don't buy a lot of nursery stock conifers. The reason for that is they tend to stock a lot of speciality varieties that may or may not take well to bonsai cultivation, and they also tend to be grafted, particularly with pines that are grafted for the nursery industry. You don't get the best grafts. 2 species of conifer that I will happily buy from garden centres and nurseries are Hinoki cypress and Yew or Taxus. Why did I choose this particular one? Well, actually, evergreens are kind of not in fashion at the moment in garden centres, particularly in the UK. I don't know what it's like where you are. So trying to find Hinoki in my local area was quite challenging, and this was simply the only one I could find. And it just happened to be, reasonably good material, so I got lucky. It cost me £8, so that's a bargain. So what do I like about this? Well, the lower trunk's got some character, it's got a bit of nice bark forming. One of the things that really appealed to me is we've got loads of branches, even near the Grafts site. We've got branches that are all usable in a bonsai design. They've got foliage nice and tight in. There is a bit of movement in the trunk, not loads of movement, but there is a bit of movement to work with. I'm not expecting loads of movement from a Hinoki, because actually they tend to suit more upright styles anyway. They tend to be tall, straight forest trees anyway. Now this one does have issues. It is grafted, which isn't ideal. We can work around that with a bit of disguise, maybe by positioning branches or selecting the front carefully. And the other issue it's got, which is harder to deal with, and it's why it's worth really having to dig around when you're in the nursery. It was clearly kept in a small pot for a number of years too long, and the roots are all circling, and so the nabari is going to be really hard to work with. But creativity comes from constraints, and so we'll try and find a way to maximise that. Like, sometimes you can find gems in nurseries, and sometimes you just got to look on the bright side of life. Not everything's going to be a banger, but you can still learn and you can still enjoy it. For £8 you can't complain really. I've also got 3 things to avoid. A thing to keep an eye out for are graft unions. You never really admire the trunk of a garden shrub, but in bonsai the trunk is an important part of the whole composition, and so if you've got this graft that they can swell or have ugly scars and look very unnatural. Now what I'm not saying is never buy something that's been grafted, because the material might have something about it that makes it appeal to you and you're willing to put up with the graft. Or maybe the graft is actually a really well executed graft and it doesn't bother you. The next thing to avoid is inverse taper. Now what I mean by that is where the trunk is a certain thickness near the soil line, and as it goes up it becomes wider instead of narrower. Narrower is more attractive, wider is less attractive. There are ways to work around it. You can disguise it, you can carve it, or you can just accept it because there's something else about the tree that's really attractive to you. But if you've got two pieces of material, you can't decide between them, one's got a bit of inverse taper, the other hasn't, you're going to favour the one that hasn't. Or just get both. The third thing to avoid are cultivars or cultivated varieties that aren't very vigorous. Now they can be really tempting because they tend to be very dwarfed and compact already, and you know they can almost look like a bonsai without any training. There are some varieties though that are so dwarfed or compact or whatever that they just aren't vigorous enough to flourish in a containerized environment such as a bonsai pot. If it's a cultivar that's got a lot going for it, or the particular plant is, you know, really amazing and has some amazing features to it, go for it. If it is a really weak cultivar, you've just got to go really slow with it and build up its strength before you do any work such as pruning or a repot. I've certainly lost material that I thought would make amazing bonsai because it was so compact and had, you know, tight foliage, and the flowers were really compact and small. I thought it'd make an amazing tree. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.